When did Congress pass a law saying pistol braces qualified? This pistol brace was sold in 2012. A guy walked into a gun store, bought it legally, walked out of the gun store with the pistol brace.
And so you had to implement this rule. This brace is exempt from your rule?
Background and current status. Here's a breakdown of the important news coming from the Supreme Court regarding a significant challenge involving arms and the ATF. This case, Vanderrock versus Garland, is shaping up to be a pivotal moment in the ongoing debate over arm regulations and ATF authority. The Supreme Court recently agreed to review the case known as Vanderrock versus Garland, which is focused on the ATF's regulation of arm parts, specifically frames and receivers. This case will be heard during the court's next term, with oral arguments scheduled for October 8th. The outcome of this case could have far-reaching implications for arm owners and the ATF's regulatory power. To understand the significance of Vanderrock versus Garland, it's helpful to look at the court's recent decision in the Cargill case. In a 6-3 ruling, the Supreme Court struck down the ATF's ban on bump stocks, which had reclassified them as MASH arms. This decision was seen as a blow to the ATF's broader regulatory reach and suggested a possible shift in how the court might view other ATF regulations. Vanderrock versus Garland challenges the ATF's rules on arm frames and receivers. These rules involve the regulation of 80% lowers, parts that are partially completed and require additional work to become functional firearms. Critics argue that these regulations represent an overreach by the ATF, limiting the rights of individuals to build arms from parts. Originally, Tactical Machining and FBC, among others, sought to halt the enforcement of the ATF's new rule through preliminary injunctions. Judge Reed O'Connor granted a limited preliminary injunction, which temporarily blocked the ATF from enforcing its rule against these companies and their customers. This was a significant victory for the plaintiffs at the time. As the case progressed, more companies, including 80% Arms, joined as plaintiffs and were granted similar injunctions. The legal fight intensified when the plaintiffs moved for a summary judgment to permanently block the ATF's rule. Judge O'Connor ruled in favor of the plaintiffs, vacating the ATF's frames and receivers rule nationwide. The ATF was not satisfied with this ruling and appealed to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. The agency then took an unprecedented step by seeking an emergency stay from the Supreme Court to prevent the enforcement of the lower court's decision. In a 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court sided with the ATF, putting a temporary hold on the lower court's judgment. Following this development, plaintiffs like 80% Arms and Defense Distributed sought to reinstate a more limited preliminary injunction from Judge O'Connor, hoping to regain some protection for their businesses and customers. With oral arguments set for October 8th, the Supreme Court's decision in this case could set a new precedent for how far the ATF can go in regulating arms. If the court rules against the ATF, it could significantly curtail the agency's ability to impose restrictive rules on arm parts and accessories. The outcome of Vanderrock versus Garland will be closely watched by both arm rights advocates and regulatory agencies. It will also likely influence future legal challenges related to arms and potentially reshape the landscape of arm regulation in the U.S. The Supreme Court's review of Vanderrock versus Garland is a critical development in the ongoing debate over arm regulations. With the court's recent decision in Cargill as a backdrop, the ruling on this case could impact how the ATF regulates arm components and potentially limit the agency's authority. As we await the October 8th arguments, the stakes are high, and the implications of the court's decision could resonate throughout the firearms community and beyond.
The Supreme Court had gone the other way. I just can't imagine what the outcry would have been. That would have been something else.
Owning guns. I mean, this is a major Second Amendment ruling about who can and cannot potentially own a firearm. So here, a big win.
You see an 8-1 decision here that says it is okay, guns out of the hands of people.
There has been a broad interpretation of the Second Amendment coming from the High Court in recent years, but my goodness, that sounds like a common sense to a lot of Americans out there.
Supreme Court and ATF. The ATF was not satisfied with this, so they appealed to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. This court also did not grant them full relief, leading the ATF to appeal to the Supreme Court on an emergency basis. The Supreme Court intervened with emergency orders, effectively blocking Judge O'Connor's limited injunction. The court's actions prevented any immediate relief from the rule, while the underlying issues were being reviewed by the Fifth Circuit. The Supreme Court's orders signaled a clear stance against granting relief that would benefit the ATF's position in the short term. After the Supreme Court's intervention, the Fifth Circuit eventually reviewed the merits of the case. The court partially upheld the lower court's decision, which had invalidated the ATF's rule. The Fifth Circuit agreed that the ATF's rule overstepped its statutory authority and did not align with the actual text of the law. However, they took issue with the lower court's nationwide vacatur of the rule, suggesting it might have been too broad. The court implied that a more narrowly scoped relief might have been appropriate. Facing a difficult position, the ATF decided to appeal directly to the Supreme Court again. This decision followed a significant recent ruling in the Cargill case, where the Supreme Court struck down an ATF rule on bump stocks, declaring it inconsistent with the statutory definition of a mash arm. This ruling sent a strong message about how the Supreme Court views ATF's regulatory reach and agency overreach more broadly. The Cargill decision was a notable 6-3 ruling that reinforced the Supreme Court's stance against excessive agency authority. It struck down the ATF's overreach and indicated a strict adherence to statutory definitions.
Would depend upon the actual design of the individual item. There were numerous different items being manufactured.
ATF estimates that not requiring the $200 stamp from the NFA for a short-barreled rifle. 20 years as a prosecutor, you know the answers to these questions. I'm done asking them. I'm just going to go with
34.
Congress pass a law. They didn't. When did the U.S. House pass a rule classifying a pistol brace as a short-barreled rifle?
This is what offends the sensibilities of Americans, whether they own these or not. Do these increase the muzzle velocity?
The stabilizing
Do these allow the, you're not answering any of the question.
Rule
Do you think you have the authority to reclassify the firearm above because it can be shouldered?
give classifications, and if things don't qualify under the rule, then they don't qualify.
This decision underscored the court's reluctance to support broad or ambiguous regulatory expansions by agencies like the ATF. In response to the Cargill ruling and ongoing legal challenges, the ATF's current strategy seems to be to minimize the impact of the decision on their new rule regarding unfinished frames and receivers. Surprisingly, the ATF barely references the Cargill decision in their current brief, focusing instead on arguments unrelated to it. This approach is seen as an attempt to sidestep the implications of the Cargill ruling. Given the Supreme Court's recent stance, the ATF's strategy might face significant challenges. The court's strong signal against agency overreach suggests that future decisions may continue to limit regulatory expansions by agencies. The review of the ATF's new rule by the Supreme Court could further clarify the boundaries of agency authority and potentially impact how similar cases are approached in the future. In essence, the legal battle surrounding the ATF's rules highlight ongoing tensions between regulatory authority and statutory limits, with recent Supreme Court decisions playing a crucial role in shaping the outcome.
For the Senate to consider my legislation, the Banning Unlawful Machine Gun Parts, or BUMP, Act. More than 20,000 people gathered for a large outdoor music festival. No one could have anticipated the nightmare that was about to unfold then. Then over the music, they started to hear what at first people thought were fireworks. Complete panic erupted. Rapid gunfire rained down on the crowd, with shots so close together that they seemed to almost bleed into each other. Concert goers ran in every direction, searching for cover where there was none.
Impact of the Cargill decision. The ATF's controversial 80% rule, which deals with unfinished arm frames and receivers, is heading to the Supreme Court for oral arguments scheduled for October 8th. This hearing is pivotal as it will address how the recent Supreme Court decision in the Cargill case impacts the ATF's current rule. The Cargill decision, which struck down the ATF's bump stock rule, is a significant precedent. In Cargill, the Supreme Court found that the ATF had overstepped its authority by redefining bump stocks as machine arms. The court emphasized adherence to statutory definitions and rejected the ATF's broad interpretation. As the ATF faces oral arguments, they will need to explain how Cargill relates to their 80% rule. They may argue that Cargill is not directly applicable because it concerns mash arms, while their rule deals with what constitutes a firearm. However, this distinction may not hold much weight. The core issue is whether the ATF is overreaching by redefining terms in a way that deviates from statutory intent. The ATF will likely attempt to distinguish the Cargill decision by highlighting differences between the legal issues in the two cases. They might argue that the 80% rule involves a different section of federal law, focusing on definitions of firearms rather than machine arms. Despite this, critics argue that the underlying problem is similar: the ATF's tendency to expand regulatory definitions beyond their original scope. The Cargill ruling serves as a strong signal that the Supreme Court is wary of agency overreach. This context makes it challenging for the ATF to justify their rule, as the court has shown a clear stance against broad and ambiguous regulatory expansions.
When did Congress pass a law saying pistol braces qualify? This pistol brace was sold in 2012. A guy walked into a gun store, bought it legally, walked out of the gun store with the pistol brace.
And so you had to implement this rule. This brace is exempt from your rule?
With the oral arguments approaching, observers are keenly anticipating how the ATF will address the implications of Cargill. The hearing promises to be a critical moment for assessing the ATF's defense of their rule and the court's stance on regulatory authority. The outcome could set a significant precedent for how agencies like the ATF can interpret and enforce regulations. Given the recent trend of Supreme Court decisions favoring limitations on agency authority, it is plausible that the court might once again strike down the ATF's rule. This would be a substantial victory for those opposing what they see as excessive regulatory overreach. The upcoming Supreme Court hearing is poised to be a key event in the ongoing debate over ATF regulations. As the court reviews the ATF's 80% rule in light of the Cargill decision, all eyes will be on how the ATF navigates this challenge. The outcome could significantly impact the future of ATF regulations and the boundaries of agency authority. Stay tuned for updates on the case as it progresses. That's all for this video, folks. See you next time.